This is a very old story that comes from the Lizard in Cornwall. And this is a story about a man called Lutey. Now Lutey, he was a Cornishman, he was a fisherman, he was a bit of a smuggler. He didn't have very much money and he lived in a little tumble-down cottage on top of the cliffs on the very end of the Lizard. And he lived there with his old wife, Mrs. Lutey, who he'd been married to for a very long time. At the time of our story, Lutey was a man in the prime of his life. He was about 50 years old. And he'd been married to Mrs. Lutey since they'd been about 16. They'd been married for a very, very long time. And they had 2 children that don't really come into our story at all. And he didn't really get on very well with Mrs. Lutey. She was a bad-tempered woman. She was always angry with him. Nothing he did was ever right. Sometimes she used to threaten him with the rolling pin. Sometimes she used to hit him with the rolling pin. But he'd been with her for a long time and she was like the weather to him. She was like a storm that had to be undergone and he didn't really pay much attention to her, whether it was fine weather or foul. And he was very happy with his life. He kept a pig, he grew vegetables in the garden, he had a little battered fishing boat, sometimes he smuggled a few bits of brandy or tobacco if he possibly could. And he was happy with his lot, he loved his garden. But most of all, he loved his dog. Now Lutey had always had a dog for the whole of his life. And when one dog grew old and died, he'd get another one. And he wasn't a man of very much imagination. So all his dogs were called Venture. That was a good name for a dog. And the Venture that he had at the moment was the best dog he'd ever had. And it was the latest in a long line of Ventures. And Lutey's favourite time of day was when the day's work was done and he'd have had his supper and he would go off for a walk and he'd walk down to the end of his garden. And the end of his garden was the very edge of the cliff. And at the edge of the cliff, he had a set of steps cut in and he used to make his way down the steps with his old dog. When he got right down to the bottom, he'd be in Helsingør Bay, right down there on the Lizard. And just behind the steps, when you got to the bottom of the cliff, there was a cave. And in that cave, Lutey used to keep his battered old fishing boat, a few lobster pots and his nets, and anything he happened to be smuggling at the time. Sometimes a crate of French brandy, perhaps a few pouches of tobacco. It was his little secret place. And every day, for the whole of his life, as long as he could remember, he'd gone for a walk every evening on the beach with whatever dog he had. And on the night that our story starts, it was Midsummer's Eve, the longest day of the year, the day when the veil between this world and the next is very thin. And Lutey was walking along, and it was the most beautiful evening. And even though it was perhaps about 7 o'clock in the evening, the sun was still shining brightly. The tide was out as far as it could possibly go, and the sand was bright with little rivulets of water running down the imprints in the sand. The only sound to be heard was the sound of the seagulls crying. And Lutey was wandering along the beach with Venture at his heels, and he was walking along, and then after a while he turned and he looked back up the cliff and he could see his old wife with her back to him getting the washing in. He could see the smoke rising from the cooking fire of the chimney, and he thought to himself, if she shouts at me now, I won't be able to hear her. And that thought gave him a lot of satisfaction. And he carried on walking, and Venture was sniffing amongst the sand, sniffing at the rocks and the seaweed. And Lutey was beachcombing, looking for treasures that the tide might have left behind. Sometimes he'd find a bit of rope with some use left in it, a piece of wood good for carving, a lobster pot that somebody had lost. He was always hoping for a case of French brandy to be washed up, but so far he'd never been lucky. And it was the most beautiful evening, and he was walking along, and then he heard a sound that made him stop. And Venture stopped too. It was a sound a little bit like the seagulls, but it wasn't that, it was different. And Lutey realised that the sound that he could hear was the sound of someone sobbing as though their heart could break. And the sound rose and it fell on the evening air, and Lutey stood still and Venture stood still and he pricked up his ears. And they were looking around to try and work out where the sound came from. And Lutey realised that because he knew that beach so well, he knew that halfway down the beach there was a big rock, and behind that rock there was a rock pool. And he knew that whenever the tide went out, that pool was very deep that was left behind, and that was where the crying was coming from. Well, Lutey was a cautious man. He never did anything in a hurry, and he began to walk very slowly in a very measured way down the beach towards the rock pool. And when he got there, the crying was really loud. He knew he was in the right place, and so very, very cautiously, he went down to the rock. He just poked his head around the rock, and there in the pool was a young woman. The most beautiful young woman he'd ever seen. There was just her head and shoulders poking out of the rock pool, and she was crying bitterly. But although she was lovely, she was like no young woman he'd ever seen before. Her hair was green and blue and dreadlocked, which is very common in our day, but in Lutey's time, it was quite unheard of. And her hair was decorated with pearls, and she wore pearls around her neck, and her eyes, all awash with tears, were emerald green. And Lutey, he didn't want to disturb her or frighten her, and also she didn't seem to have very many clothes on. And so he gave a little cough. And the young woman let out a loud cry, "Oh!" And she sank down further into the rock pool, and as she did so, something began to poke out the other end. It was a tail. And Lutey realised that he was in the presence of a mermaid. Now, being a Cornishman and a fisherman, Lutey knew all about mermaids, or he thought he did. But there was something about mermaids that he didn't know, and he should have done. He should have done, as we shall see later on. And Lutey said, "My dear young woman, you appear to be in some distress. Is there anything I can do to help you?" And the mermaid said, "Oh," she said, "I was cut off by the tide and stranded where you see me here in this rock pool. And if I can't get back across the spit of sand in time to cook my man his tea, I swear to you, he'll eat my babies." Lutey was horrified. He'd never heard of anyone eating their babies before, and he began to think that perhaps that's why mermaids are so few and far between. And he said, "Well, is there anything I can do to help you?" And the mermaid said, "If you could carry me across the spit of sand and let me go in the sea, I could get back in time to cook my man his tea, and my babies would be spared. I can't tell you how many of my tender young ones have passed between that brute's jaws." Well, Lutey was horrified. He said, Of course I'll help you. Of course I'll carry you across the sand." And the mermaid said, "Moreover, if you will do that for me, I will grant to you 3 wishes. Anything you want shall be yours." And Lutey said, you don't have to do that. I'd like to help you anyway." And he climbed down to the rock pool, and he tried to pick up the mermaid, and it was very difficult. She was extremely heavy. Her tail alone must have weighed several stone, and Lutey wasn't a very big man. And also he didn't quite know where to put his hands because she had very few clothes on, and he didn't want to cause offence, but eventually he managed to heave her up out of the water, and the water went streaming off her tail, and he began to carry her very awkwardly down the beach with Venture at his heels. Well, she was very heavy, and it was very hard work, but Lutey kept going, and after a while he began to realise that the mermaid was behaving in rather a strange manner. She was twining her arms more and more tightly around Lutey's neck, and she was gazing into his eyes with her bright green ones. And she said, "Oh," she said, "you are a good-looking man. I've never seen one more handsome. I've always fancied a man with 2 tails instead of 1, by which she meant Lutey's legs. And she said, "Why don't you come and live with me under the sea? Come and live with me under the sea. I will fashion for you gills such as fishes have. There is no death down there. Only sunken Spanish galleons and cases and cases of French brandy and much gold." Well, Lutey didn't know what to think. Nobody'd ever called him good-looking before, not even Mrs. Lutey in their far-off courting days. And he wasn't sure that he wanted to go with the mermaid. He didn't much like his wife, but he liked his life. He was happy. He couldn't imagine making a change. He didn't know what to say. And he tried to avoid the mermaid's eyes, and he went on walking down the beach. And after a while, the mermaid, she put her hand to her belt and she pulled out a little purse, just like a fish's egg case. And she said, "Take my purse, put it in your pocket, and if ever you wish to call for me again, dip it in the water and call out my name 3 times. Morvena, 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 and wherever I am, I will come for you on the next tide." Well, Lutey didn't know what to say. He took the little purse and he stuffed it in his pocket, and he carried on walking. And presently the mermaid said, "Even if you do not wish to come with me, I have promised you 3 wishes, and 3 wishes you shall have. What would you like for your first wish?" Well, Lutey couldn't think of anything. He wasn't really a man of any imagination, which is shown by the fact that every dog he'd ever owned was called Venture. He really couldn't think what he would want to have. And he carried on walking and thinking. But Lutey was a kind man. And all of a sudden he had an idea. And he said, "For my first wish, I would like to have the gift of the healing touch. I would like to be able to touch sick people and make them well again. Is that the kind of wish that you can grant me?" And the mermaid, she looked at Lutey as though she was seeing him for the first time, and her green eyes softened, and she said, "That's a very kind wish. Consider it granted. What will you have for your second wish?" Well, by now, Lutey was warming to his theme, and he said, "For my second wish, I would like that gift of the healing touch to be passed down to my children and their children and their children's children, on and on, so that it's never lost. Can you do that?" The mermaid said, "It's done. What will you have for your last wish?" But by now, they'd got right down to the very edge of the sea, and the waves of the sea were lapping at the toes of Lutey's boots, and I really think that he would have gone into the water there and then with the mermaid, and that would have been the end of the story if it hadn't been for Venture. Now, Venture had been following Lutey all this time. He didn't like the look of the mermaid, he didn't like the smell of the mermaid, and he didn't like the things the mermaid was saying to his master, and besides, Lutey was the man that fed him. So just at the moment that Lutey was really teetering on the brink, he really looked as though he was going to leap into the water with the mermaid in his arms, Venture let out a great bark. Now, he wasn't a dog that was given to barking very much. He only barked for a good reason. He was very well trained. And the sound of his bark seemed to break the spell for Lutey. And Lutey, he twisted his head round and he looked back up the beach. He looked at the cliff. He looked at the back of his wife still getting in the washing. He looked at the smoke rising from his cooking fire, and he turned back to the mermaid and he said, You horrible fish!" And he flung that mermaid as hard as he could. It wasn't very hard, she was a big mermaid. And she landed with a splash in the sea, and a moment or two later she came up again and she was laughing. She was laughing at Lutey as she bobbed there. And she said, "You haven't had your last wish. I can see into hearts and minds of men. I know what you would choose. In 9 years to the day, I come for you. Goodbye, my love." And she dived down under the water and she was gone. And Lutey, he sank down onto the beach. He was exhausted, whether it was part of the enchantment of the mermaid or just the weight of carrying her or the shock of everything. He couldn't rise to his feet again. All he could do was crawl on his hands and knees back up the beach, with Venture nosing him along. And when he got to the bottom of the steps, he couldn't climb up them. It was too much for him. So he crawled into the cave. He climbed into his fishing boat, pulled a sail over himself, and with Venture snuggled at his side, he slept all night long. And he was wakened in the morning by Mrs. Lutey, standing over him out on the edge of the boat, brandishing the rolling pin. She was furious. She couldn't understand why he hadn't been in all night. And Lutey couldn't remember anything. He began to think that perhaps he'd been in the pub all night. But if that was so, he couldn't understand why there was still money in his pocket and why he didn't have a headache. He was completely bewildered. And he followed Mrs. Lutey up the steps with her threatening him and scolding him. And he made his way into the cottage and she got his dried up breakfast out of the old range and she slapped it on the table in front of him, and Lutey began to eat it just to please her, even though it was all dried up and horrible. But it wasn't until he put his hand in his pocket to pull out his handkerchief to wipe his mouth, when instead he pulled out the mermaid's purse. And when he held it in his hand, he remembered everything. But Lutey thought that hobnobbing with mermaids would go far worse for him than just being in the pub all night, so he never said a word. He was completely quiet about it. But after he'd finished his breakfast, he did feel that he just needed a quick half of cider in the witch ball just to steady his nerves a bit. So he made his way through the village, and he was just on his way to the pub when he bumped into a friend of his. And that friend was just coming out of the doctor's surgery. Now, his friend was in a bad way. He'd been milking the cow that morning, and the cow had kicked him and had broken his arm in 3 places. It was a very nasty break. And the doctor had set it and strapped it up. There was a big splint on it and bandages. And as Lutey looked at his friend, he remembered the mermaid's wishes. And he put out his hand and just touched his friend on the arm very gently. And a strange look came over his friend's face. And his friend started pulling off the bandages, pulling off the splint, and he couldn't believe it. Not only was his arm not broken or damaged in any way, it was better than it had ever been before. And he looked at Lutey and he didn't say anything. Lutey didn't say anything either. But by tea time that day, there was a queue of people all the way down the street in the Lizard at Lutey's cottage, coming to him with all their ailments to be cured. There were people with measles, there were people with athlete's foot, there were people with nits, there were people with every kind of illness and disease you could possibly think of. And Lutey cured them all. He just touched them and they were cured. And the next day, there was a queue of people down the road, all the way as far as Plymouth. People were coming from all over Cornwall to be cured by Lutey. And because Lutey was such a kind man, he never turned anyone away. And that became his life. And he never asked anybody for money either. But people were so grateful to him, they wanted to pay him. They were poor people. Sometimes payment was just half a dozen new laid eggs or a pot of jam. Sometimes it was a pot of honey or some sausages. But if people had money, they would give it to him. And Lutey never spent it. He put it all on a little blue jar on the mantelpiece and he saved it. And so it was that by the end of 8 years, Lutey had enough money in that pot to have built for himself a fine new fishing boat. It was a beautiful boat. It took a year to build. And when it was finished, everybody was amazed by this boat because hardly anybody could afford to have a new boat built there. But this was such a beautiful little boat. It was painted blue, it had a red sail, and the name of it, painted on the side in beautiful lettering, was the Mulvana. No one knew why. And 9 years to the day that Lutey first met the Mermaid, that little boat was ready for launching. And Lutey, he went down to the beach with his friend and they launched the little boat. He didn't have Venture anymore. Venture would have been a very old dog because he'd been alive by then. And they got into the boat, but it was a great sadness to them. They couldn't sail it. And the reason they couldn't sail it was because there was no wind. It was an absolutely flat calm. The sea was as clear and as smooth as glass. And they had to use the oars. You can't sail a boat without wind. It's not a thing you can do. And so he and his friend, they were a bit sad, but they were still very happy to be launching the boat. And they began to row their little boat. They rowed it a good long way out into the bay until they found a place they liked the look of. And then they took the anchor and they lowered it over the side and it went down and down and down into the deep water. And they were just about to cast their nets when out of that completely flat sea there began to rise a wave. And that wave began to rise higher and higher and higher. And you don't get waves without wind. It wasn't a natural wind. It was enormous. It went up and up and up and up. And Lutey and his friend, they stood looking over the boat transfixed. Lutey's friend was terrified. He was making the sign of the cross and saying the Lord's Prayer. But Lutey was just gazing intently into the wave. And the wave went up and up and up. And last it curled over. And just before it broke, they could see, swimming in the curve of the wave, on the tip of her tail, with all of her beautiful body out of the water, the mermaid. And she never said anything. She just looked at Lutey. And Lutey, he never looked at his friend, but he just said, "My hour has come." And without another word, he dived over the edge of the fishing boat. He came up in the curve of the wave next to the mermaid, and the wave broke. And for a moment or two, Lutey's friend, he saw Lutey and the mermaid swimming lovingly together. And then they disappeared under the sea. The wave was gone, and once again, it was as smooth and as clear as glass. And no one in this life ever saw Lutey again. But they do say that on the Lizard, to this very day, Lutey's descendants still have the gift of the healing touch. And that's the story of Lutey and the Mermaid.